From the Weston A. Price Foundation, welcome to the Wise Traditions podcast for wise traditions in food, farming, and the healing arts. We are your source for scientific knowledge and traditional wisdom to help you achieve optimal health.
Welcome to Wise Traditions, Jill.
Thank you so much for having me, Hilda. I am so excited to chat.
Me too. I wanted to start off by asking you about that moment when you found your grandmother's recipe box and you were so excited. What did you discover in those moments?
Yes, so I was a young home cook at that point, and I had started broaching into from scratch meals and homemade biscuits and all of these things I hadn't tried before. And I had these memories of my grandmother. She died when I was 9, but prior to that, like, she made the most amazing meals, like her angel food cake and her roast dinners and her mashed potatoes, and I still can taste them. And so, I'd never thought about how she made them, but as this new young home cook, I was so excited I would kind of finally discover her secrets and get all of her from scratch wisdom. And so one summer we went home and my mom pulled out her recipes for me, and I ripped into the folders and the boxes, and I discovered what I was looking for wasn't there. I actually was pretty disappointed to realize that a lot of the recipes she had written down in her own handwriting, it called for margarine and Betty Crocker cake mix and Jell-O and Oleo and Cool Whip, all of those darlings of her era, right? And so it kind of was an awakening in a sense, and it didn't downplay her cooking for me because I knew she had those skills. I just don't think they were appearing in her recipe box. But it was a good reminder of how far-reaching this industrial food has come, and how seductive it was for people of her generation. You know, they had the from scratch, but then they didn't know how to resist the call of the marketers and the corporations. And so it was pretty interesting revelation. But I was able to redeem it down the road and figure out my own from scratch versions of a lot of those things. But it was interesting.
Yeah, and so she was cooking from scratch, kind of, right? Like, she had these,
Kind of.
as Dr. Price calls it, the displacing foods of modern commerce that she was starting to fold into maybe her grandmother's or her mother's recipes.
Yes. And that's what I think. She had an amazing foundation because she had been cooking since she was a little girl, probably Great Depression era or before. And so she had the foundation, but she was so enamored by those pieces that did displace those more wholesome ingredients. You know, the margarine was displacing the butter, and I know she could make a cake from scratch, but she was enamored with Betty Crocker. And so you could totally see those swaps starting to happen.
And do you feel like nowadays those swaps, how can I put this, we're even further away from those original roots of cooking with simple single source ingredients?
Absolutely. In fact, I think we've come so far, at least in some of my observations, that now people, let's take cakes, for example, people consider a Betty Crocker cake mix to be from scratch, whereas most of them would just prefer to go buy it at the bakery at Walmart, right? Or have someone else make it for them. And so I think we've come many layers out of this understanding of what food really is.
Absolutely. So during our conversation today, I want to contrast this versus that. So why is this, cooking with more natural, whole food, real, single ingredient foods and cooking from scratch, why is that different than, say, cooking from a box or using some of the more convenient foods off the grocery store shelf?
Yeah, so many pieces to that. It's such a good question. You know, I think the primary motivation for me, at least, to choose the harder route, let's face it, it takes more effort. I wouldn't say it's harder, but it takes more thought to cook from scratch. The primary motivation for me, and I'm guessing many of your audience members, is just the health benefits and the nutrition benefits, right? Because in order to get the convenience foods, we have to add a lot of stuff to them, because food wasn't meant to sit on a shelf for months or years, and it wasn't meant to be packaged the way we package it. So we have to do a lot of things to it, kind of turn it into this Frankenstein situation to make that work. And in the process, we take out a lot of the good stuff and we put in a lot of junk. So I think that's the biggest motivation. That's why I initially got into this.
Oh, really?
But then yeah, absolutely.
want to hear more about that, but hold on. My battery
Yeah.
is actually getting
Uh-oh.
low. So let me just plug in my computer. Give me 10 seconds.
Yes, no worries, no
And
worries.
I'll remember 448. Okay.
Okay.
Okay. All right. So,
Good. Okay.
all right. Well, we'll find out. We'll find out more about that in a little bit. But keep on with your train of thought.
Yeah. So that was why I came into it, was just the health benefits for myself and my family. But what I've discovered in the process of cooking from scratch more and more over the last decade or so is there's a lot of other benefits. And I think for me, a big piece of that is mental health in addition to physical health, and just this idea of cooking giving us an opportunity to slow down and to be more mindful and to kind of bring ourselves back into our bodies, because we live in so much chaos and busyness as modern people, especially as moms. We're running our kids all over and we have all these obligations. And even if you're not working outside the home, even if you're a stay-at-home mom, you have all these things pulling on you. And we have that choice where cooking can just be one more thing I have to do. Oh my gosh, it's drudgery. Or we can kind of reframe that and use it as a chance to recenter ourselves and to use our hands and to connect to the natural world and to create something useful and amazing for ourselves and our families. And so I think that's one of the side effects of cooking with these single ingredients, with basic ingredients that people often overlook.
So one of the this versus that's is drudgery versus joy and creativity, really.
Absolutely, yeah.
So, okay. So let's say I want to lean into that, but I am so busy and I just don't know where to start, Jill. Like, how could I start to reframe not only my perspective, but actually carve out the time to invest in making food from scratch?
Yeah, good question. And I think that's a really big issue for so many of us. Even myself, there's seasons where I'm like, man, I don't have as much time in the calendar as I do other times of year. I think the biggest thing to remember is that it doesn't have to be a giant production. And we have this perception, and honestly, we've been sold a perception by the very brilliant marketers that cooking it from scratch is complicated and it's extremely time consuming. And it's always the equivalent of like a Thanksgiving Day meal prep, right? Where it takes 4 days just to get one meal on the table. And that really couldn't be further from the truth. And when we shed all of those stories that we've been told, cooking from scratch can be extremely simple. It can be as easy as just figuring out what your protein is. You can put that in a crock pot or an instant pot. We have those magical tools as modern people that our great grandmas didn't have. It's roasting a chicken. It's throwing a beef roast in the crock pot. It's making a simple meatloaf. There's so many ways we can just let the appliances do the work for us or let the oven do the work for us. And then for me, I find my protein and then I add a vegetable or maybe a potato or something simple to the side for a little bit of carbohydrates or whatever you want to call it. And for us, that's the extent of most of my meals. It's not a huge ordeal. It doesn't take multiple days for one dinner. It can be as simple as you'd like it to be.
I love that. A good friend of mine always says simplicity is gourmet, and that really takes a lot of pressure
Yes.
off.
It does. Yeah. One of my favorite two cookbooks, it's Alice Waters' The Art of Simple Food, and then Samin Nosrat is Salt, Fat, Acid, Heat. And those women are incredible chefs, like professional chefs. And what I love about those books is they are as simple as it comes. They're using everyday ingredients that are whole and single form that come from the earth, and they just teach you these little things to help you put them together, and it's delicious and the flavors shine through and it's not an ordeal whatsoever.
Well, that's encouraging. The next level, I think, is growing our own food, not just buying it, but growing it. That feels like this versus that. Just buying it at the farmer's market or even from a farmer, it seems so much simpler than growing it. Talk to us about that contrast.
Yeah, and I think you're right. It is simpler for sure. So why would someone want to choose growing their own food? It's a legitimate question, especially in our day and age with supermarkets and all of the convenience. And so I think this is even more of a conscious choice that we get to make, even more so than the cooking itself. And I would say the reasons that I choose to grow food, even though I have a lot on my plate and there's easier ways to procure it, is again, those side effects of gardening and those side effects of keeping animals. Number one, I get to know exactly what's in it, and I don't have to worry about chemicals or pesticides or herbicides or those things creeping in, because sometimes even the best labeling practices don't cover all of those things. I know where it's coming from. I know it didn't have to be trucked. Some of our foods and our produce especially, it travels up to 1,500 miles to get to us. So I know I don't have to worry about that and the impact on our environment from all of that moving around. But more than that, growing food for me, whether I'm growing my own meat or dairy or vegetables, is a connection. And it's a connection to the earth and to the cycles of nature. And again, that kind of grounds me and brings me back to what matters in this world where it's so easy to get off kilter and to kind of get out of balance with the technology and the fast paced. And so for me, it's a sense of, or a sort of meditation. And it doesn't mean it's always easy. And it doesn't mean there's not days where I'm out there sweating or freezing, or I'm kind of like, oh man, this could be easier if I just go to the grocery store. Absolutely, those times exist. But making those harder choices sometimes, they pay off in ways that really matter for us and our families.
What was the first thing that you grew?
I believe, I'm trying to remember, they kind of happened in tandem. I think I started my garden first, and then the chickens came very soon after. And I impulse bought my first flock of chickens. It was like a Friday night, found them on Craigslist and drove to get them in my car, put them in the back seat. And there I was. But yeah, I think vegetables came a little bit before the chickens, but it was all a big learning curve, that whole time frame.
Tell us about some of the mistakes or the early challenges you faced.
Yes, I have messed up all the things. I think most notably, I struggle the most in the garden. I've always had an easier time with the animals. We live in Wyoming on the prairie, and so this was bison country. And so our land is really designed for grazing animals. So that makes raising beef for us pretty easy. So I've always been able to do that without a whole lot of issue. But man, those vegetables, it was a struggle. And so I've done everything from using improperly composted manure, and I put all the grass seed right back in the garden and planted a lawn. And it was like a beautiful lawn, but I didn't want a lawn there. I've accidentally used mulch. I love deep mulch. I love that technique. It's brilliant, but I accidentally used mulch that had been contaminated with an herbicide, and that got into my soil and it hurt my tomatoes and all of my plants. I've actually done that twice. We've had major hail out disasters. We get a lot of hail here on the prairie, and so I've lost entire gardens in the matter of minutes to hailstorms. I've had all the bugs, the worms, the beetles, the grasshoppers. So, if you can mess it up in the garden, I have absolutely done it. But we are still growing a lot of food, even amid all the missteps. And so, there's times I've cried over the garden and times that I've yelled at the garden. And other times we've had incredible successes, but we keep trucking just because of those benefits that come beyond just the vegetables.
Yeah. And when you were talking earlier about connecting with the earth, connecting with the environment, connecting with animals, we just picture all the joyous moments, but we're still connecting when the hail falls and the tomatoes don't grow or the bugs got them, right? That's still connecting.
Yes.
It's painful connection, but it's connection nonetheless.
Yeah, and it's a good reminder, I think, of kind of how we fit into nature, and a reminder that we don't have the ultimate control, which is a humbling thought, but I think it's a healthy thought to know that we're a part of it. And we can't always control. And we sometimes have to learn to be flexible, and we have to learn how to adjust with the seasons or the weather patterns. Or, some years are great for one crop and they're horrible for the other. And some years have a ton of grasshoppers and some years have none. So it's learning that flexibility and that nuance, which is often missed, I think, in so much of our modern world.
Well, and speaking of things missed in the modern world, I'm thinking about another this versus that. Do it yourself versus hire an expert. So talk to us a little bit about kind of the pleasure and satisfaction that comes from tackling something new.
Yeah, absolutely. So I call my husband and myself, we're serial DIYers, almost to a fault. where we love figuring out how to do things ourselves. Sometimes it works out, sometimes it doesn't. And I guess I want to preface all of these pieces in this conversation with, we're not purists about any of them. So I grow a lot of food. I still buy some food. I cook a lot. There are seasons of my life where I buy certain items because I just can't cook all the things all the time. There are times we are amazing do-it-yourselfers and other times where we'll hire a contractor to do a project. So I think you have to know what is really calling to you and what serves you, and then be willing to leave the rest. So this is going to be really a personal thing for everybody listening. You get to decide. But it kind of goes back to the idea of working with our hands. And there's so much of our modern world that has stripped that away from us. We've strove for convenience above all costs over the last 150 years, since the advent of the Industrial Revolution. And a lot of that's been good. I mean, there's things I'm very thankful for within that. But as a result, we've accidentally eliminated the opportunities where we can use our hands and use our brains and be creative and create. And humans are designed to create. We're wired for that. Like, we thrive within the act of creation. And if you think about the average American's everyday life, that's kind of been taken away from us by accident. And now everything is pushing a button or tapping a screen or letting someone else take care of it for us. And so I think we can choose to reclaim those pieces, bring them back into our life. And that's going to look different for all of us. For me, that looks like baking bread without a bread machine, and planting my garden, and making things and building things around the house. And for someone else, that could be working on cars, or making pottery, or painting with watercolor. So there's lots of different ways to do that. But I think building that back into our routine, whether that's a daily routine or a weekly routine or a monthly routine, it goes a long way to helping us, just come back to center and stay happier and keeping us human.
Yeah, what came to mind as you were speaking was the Little House on the Prairies series by Laura Ingalls Wilder. And I think Pa did everything. He was the one who bridled the horses. He was the one that fixed the house when a shingle fell off. He was the one that went hunting, like all the things. And there is a kind of creativity and satisfaction and neuroplasticity for the people, for the one listening who's like, I'm all about, building new neural pathways and I'm going to biohack. Well, guess what? Maybe if we went back to ancestral ways that required more of us, we would have that neuroplasticity and that cognitive function and that overall sense of not only well-being, but of satisfaction when we get a job done.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a lot of really neat science around this. A few months ago, I had a neuroscientist named Kelly Lambert come on my podcast, and she's done some really neat research around this. And she discovered, or at least she talked about on my podcast, this system called the effort-driven reward circuit. And it's a part of our body, and it connects our hands to our brain. And I won't get into all the details because honestly, I can't remember all the nitty-gritty of the science. But basically, when we work with our hands, we do something outside of tapping a screen or pressing a button. It's connected to our brain, and it releases the happy chemicals, that make us feel good, the dopamines and such. And so she was adamant that, as modern humans, the science shows us we have to keep creating and building and doing things with our hands, even if it's, moving all the furniture and vacuuming the carpet, or, cutting up the lettuce for the salad. She's like, we have to keep that involved in our everyday lives. Otherwise, it kind of messes up our brains. And so that was really enlightening for me because I had felt that, but to hear it backed up by the data was pretty cool.
Wow. It reminds me of language learning too. They always say use it or lose it. If we don't use it, we're going to lose that ability. And then maybe this is one reason we have Chat GPT now and other AI, because we want to outsource even the creative parts of our brain.
Right. And, as a creative, as someone who creates, I understand the tension. I'm sure you understand this too. When we create, there is that tension there. And there's been many a time in a project where you have that, oh my gosh, I don't know if I'm going to get it. I don't know if the idea will come. I don't know if the title will come. I don't know if I can get this paragraph right. And that's uncomfortable. But then on the flip side, when you get the title and you figure out the paragraph and it all starts flowing, it's to me, I think that's one of the best feelings in the entire world, where you're like, I got it. The picture is just what I wanted, or the title's just what I wanted. And if we always outsource that and we remove that tension and that discomfort, we never get to experience that joy and satisfaction from overcoming and figuring it out. So it's such a double-edged sword. And I wonder, as we see things like Chat GPT growing and becoming more a part of our culture, like what side effects will that have in the long run?
Good question. Now let's dive a little deeper with the DIY thing, because you said you and your husband are serial DIYers. Tell us about a project that went great, and then tell us about a project that not so much.
Oh, there's been so many. So I would say a fun project that we recently did is we've done a lot of homestead projects, a ton over the last decade, but we've shifted recently into really trying to help grow and infuse life into a little community that's near us. And so in 2021, we bought an old rundown soda fountain. It was one of the only operating restaurants in that town. It's 175 people, so it's tiny. And it needed a lot of work. And it was one of those big, scary, audacious projects where, everyone's like, I don't know if this was a good idea. Like, how are you going to make this work? And we worked on it for a solid year, and we flipped it and renovated it and gutted it. And it turned out so good. And it's so fun to see it thriving, and it's in full operation. And we have people stopping all over the United States to come get milkshakes. And so that was a really successful project, not without its trials in the middle. Like, there was plenty of days where it was frustrating and hard, but we kept at it. So that was an example of a project that with a happy ending. And I'd say there's been lots of things around the homestead that I would say they all had happy endings ultimately, but we had to go through the bumps first. So one infamous example is when we first started building out our homestead, we weren't very good at planning or thinking ahead. We just took action, and that can be a good thing. I think taking action without overthinking is healthy. It can also be unhealthy. And so we were so excited, we just started building fence lines, and we never planned out like, wait, where are the trees going to go? Or where will this pasture be, where we always want it to be? So we ended up moving several fence lines 3 different times. And that's a lot of work. Like, you're pounding posts, then you're removing posts, and you're stringing wire, and then you're unstringing wire. And so every single time we would be pulling out the fence line, we'd be like, oh my gosh, this is so embarrassing. But it was a good lesson. So it was a fail at the time, but it ended up being okay. But a good reminder to think big picture sometimes before you start pounding fence posts.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, and you said a lot of your projects have been homesteading one, and this is my final this versus that. Homesteading and self-reliance versus living off, what's available in your region from the market and with jobs and all this stuff, like a regular conventional life, I guess I would say.
Yeah. And I think what I love about homesteading right now, and it's really experiencing a resurgence, I'm sure a lot of people are aware of that. I love that we get to mix the best of both worlds. I love that we get to mix some old and some new. And I think that's a special privilege that we have as people living in this era. It's really easy to romanticize our ancestors, and there's plenty of pieces of that I wish we still had, absolutely. But I know that maybe my great-great-grandpa, who was hauling buckets of water or freezing in his uninsulated shack, would have loved to have my insulated house and my wood stove and my running water and my light bulbs. So I think we have to be careful to not romanticize all of those pieces. But I would love to see people be able to be more conscious and intentional with how they're living and how the modern world is affecting them. Because I think so often we get caught into this mindset that this is just how it is. This is just what we do now in 2020, whatever. Like, this is how people live, and this, there's no sense questioning it. But we can question it, and it's healthy to question it. And I think when we do, we give ourselves more options and more freedom. And so for me, maybe it's not this versus that on this one as much as how can we take the pieces, a little bit from each side, and weave them together to make our lives richer, more connected, and more fulfilling.
And actually, I feel like that's what we've been saying all along in this versus that, that we're not saying you have to cook every single meal at home by grinding your own flour and or whatever, all those things. You can actually do a combination of things. And when we do, like I do, buy things from a farmer's market or a farmer, we're supporting his work and saying thank you to him. I might not ever have my own homestead or farm. Maybe one day I will, but if I
Yes.
don't, there's still a community. So it's a combination kind of life. And most likely, most listeners right now are in that hybrid space, I would guess.
I believe so. Yes. And I love what you said about having that opportunity to support other people doing the work. I think that's powerful. And I don't want anyone listening to feel down on themselves if they're never going to move to a homestead or they never can move to a homestead. I don't think it's necessarily about how much land you own or what perfect little set of farm animals you have. It's really more about, are you aware? Are you aware of what you're eating? Are you aware of how it's being grown? Are you engaged in your community? Are you mindful of your impacts on the environment around you? I think that's really, to me, the homesteading mindset more than, oh, she has 50 acres and she has a milk cow. I think if we can get more people to adopt that mindset, that's where the power is.
And speaking of supporting others, are there ways in which we can support homesteaders? I mean, my idea and my understanding of a homesteader is a person that is kind of self sufficient with their family on a plot of land with their own food, animals, produce, and such that they're growing, and it's just enough for them. But are there homesteaders who have other offerings that we can invest in?
Yeah, I think we're seeing a lot more homesteaders kind of start to branch out these days. And they're not going to be necessarily maybe making all of their income from their little farm or their homestead, but a lot of folks are selling eggs or they're selling beef shares or maybe raw milk or vegetables. So I think if you can find those people in your area and support them, and here's the deal. It's probably not going to be as convenient for you as going to the grocery store, right? If you're going to buy honey from the neighbor down the road, you're going to have to coordinate that and text them and make sure they have enough and it's in season. So it will take more effort from you. But I say if you're willing to put forth that effort, that means a lot to the homesteader or the farmer. And it goes a long way in creating that community, strengthening your local food resources, and just building those relationships. So I think that's huge. Also, just being a cheerleader, homesteading can be discouraging, and there's a lot of people who still don't understand it. So even I still get like the raised eyebrows and the comments sometimes and people kind of poking fun at it, which I'm pretty used to that now. But man, when you have somebody come over and they're like, this is so cool what you're doing, and can I help you butcher chickens next fall, or can I help you plant your garden or process your tomatoes? Like that's just really special, and I really appreciate those people who are willing to come alongside. That means a lot.
That is a beautiful thing. And I agree with you that there's a resurgence of interest in homesteading and these practical things of working with our hands and so forth. So I'm thinking this versus that, today versus yesterday. What attitudes do you see shifting in the populace at large, or maybe even in your own heart today versus Joe Winger 8 years ago?
Yeah. Oh, great question. I think for me, the biggest shift is when I started this lifestyle, I was in it very much for just the tangible pieces. I wanted the eggs and I wanted the tomatoes and I wanted to figure out how to make sourdough bread. And that was a great motivator at the beginning. And now, all these years later, I've asked myself many times over the years, should I still do this? Because I don't technically, if you want to be honest, I don't have time to do this. I have multiple businesses. I'm doing lots of different things, homeschooling kids, running a restaurant. I have lots of things to do. So outside looking in, people would go, Jill, you don't have time to make the bread and keep the garden. What are you doing? And I've had that conversation with myself. And what I keep coming back to is I keep doing this and I will continue to do this because it's more than the sum of its parts. And yes, I love the bread and the tomatoes, but it's the connection with my family. It's the connection to the soil. It's the connection to my food. It's the mental health benefits I get from being able to go out to the garden after a long day and take some deep breaths and plunge my hands into the soil. And it's just that greater understanding that this lifestyle has given me about my place in the world. And to me, that is the harvest that I'm truly after. I like all the other pieces, but that's the most important part. And that's been a big shift for me. And I love that. And I love seeing other homesteaders, as they kind of sink into this lifestyle and mature into it, also having that same revelation. And that's pretty powerful stuff.
Yeah, I would say so. So if there's a person right now listening who's like, I am so happy to have heard this podcast and so many others, and I'm ready to dive in, do you have any recommendations for how to get going with this kind of intangible, tangible way of living?
Yeah. So I think my favorite place to encourage people to start is the food, which this podcast is such a great place to get food information. Because we're eating 3 times a day at least, and those food buying choices, maybe you're not growing food, maybe you are buying food, but just what you buy and how you buy it has a big impact on your communities and on your health. And so just educating yourself, and you're not going to be perfect overnight. I don't expect you to go through your cabinets and it's going to be like Ma Ingalls cupboard in 24 hours. Absolutely not. This is a process. Don't feel overwhelmed, but educating yourself, what's in that thing that I'm eating? And why would this be better? Or what happens when this ingredient's factory farmed versus grown organically or regeneratively? Like, just start to learn. And I think you'll start to see that path in front of you become more and more clear.
Oh, I love that so much, because the Weston A. Price Foundation's mission is education, research, and activism, and education is number one. So
Yes.
Thank you for all the things that you've shared that are really inspiring and honest. And I want to ask you now the question I like to pose at the end of the show. If the listener could just do one thing to improve their health, because a lot of folks are listening who just want to feel better, more energetic, maybe have more clarity cognitively and so forth. If there's one thing they could do to improve their health, what would you recommend that they do, Jill?
Oh, man. So many options. I would say, we talked about food. So, food's a big one, but there's a lot of pieces to food. But let's say we wanted just to get as simple as possible. I would say make sure you're spending time outside every single day. Even when it's a little cold, even when it's a little hot, doesn't have to be hours. Go for a walk, sit on the porch, let the natural light bathe you, whether that's morning light or that evening light. Just start to become more engaged in your natural world. And you might be surprised at the domino effect that happens when you start doing that.
I love it so much, Jill. Thank you for this conversation. It's been a pleasure.
Absolutely. So fun. Thanks for having me, Hilda.